There's real money involved with this. Gary can probably tell you about that from the MPPD perspective, what it costs to build this capacity over time. Obviously the fuel is important too, but very significant. So if I have a lot of wind, does it obviate the need for me to build any capacity? Because we just said it's an energy resource, okay? And so therefore I have to have the same megawatts of generation capacity if I have wind or not to serve that load 10 years from now. And as it turns out, it does have a little, okay, if I look at this in the right perspective. I can show mathematically using the same approaches that electric utilities use to measure reliability of a certain plan going forward. And I can show that wind generation does have a little bit of capacity down. It's small though, it might be 10% of the nameplate, it might be 5%. Maybe it'll be a little bit more. We'll have to see, and it depends on obviously the resource and the nature of the load and those sorts of things. So does wind need to be backed up? It doesn't. Every resource needs to be backed up, okay? Resources back each other up. That's how we guarantee reliability, okay? In fact, when NPPD built Cooper Nuclear Station, that created the need to carry more reserves, okay, from all the other units in case that tripped out. That's how it works. But I didn't one-for-one back it up, okay? I use probability statistics to help me out here, right? I also use my neighbors. I have transmission ties to my neighbors and they have capacity. It's not very likely that they're going to lose their big nuclear unit at the same time that I lose my big nuclear unit, so we can kind of share that, right? And cut the cost for everybody. Wind generation forecasting is a key though, and probably the key going forward. This variability and uncertainty that we see, we have to get a handle on, okay? We don't necessarily have to reduce it. We need to quantify it very well because that will allow us to change our operational practice going forward so that we can cope with it. This is another real advantage of being in this particular business in that there's a cadre of folks in the wind industry that are actually PhD meteorologists that run the computational fluid dynamic models that they use for weather forecasting and all that kind of stuff, but run them for a little bit different purpose, and that's for forecasting production from a wind plant tomorrow or over the next few days kind of thing. And there's a lot of science going on there because that's not what those models were designed to do originally, okay? But that's what we're adapting them to do now. So there may be some deep underlying science that needs to be changed. And what we're seeing is that NASA and NOAA, all those folks are now coming into this industry with their significant intellectual horsepower to work on this problem. So I think the foundation for forecasting will improve. One of the great needs in forecasting is data. Okay, you have these models, but there's so much atmosphere, and I only have data for just such a sparse part of it. And the weather services have this challenge forever. But we're looking at satellite networks now and going forward where our ability to observe the atmosphere will be tremendously improved, which will help the models. Even so, there's significant value that we can achieve today with the current technology for wind generation forecasting that we have. And there's a lot of activity going on in this area all across the country. We need to learn quickly though, because the neighbors to the west, Public Service Colorado, have a lot of wind already, and their operators are feeling a little bit queasy on some days and that they don't know what it's going to do. That's a real problem that we need to address. We've heard about the recent events. Maybe was probably heard about the one in Texas. That was all over CNN. There's been similar occurrences in Europe, Denmark especially. One thing to keep in mind is that with regard to the Texas event, they lost a lot of wind generation, but it didn't happen all at one time. It took 3 hours. They have a forecasting system now that wasn't operational when that event occurred. And the forecasting system actually picked that event up and could have given them up to like 6 hours, even in the day ahead forecast, they detected that. So the idea isn't to prevent it from happening. The idea is to know that it's going to happen so that we can take the appropriate measures beforehand. Okay? Yeah, question.
My understanding that they had it available, they just didn't use it.
It wasn't operational yet. I mean, it was running in parallel, and it wasn't being used in the control room. It is now. One final topic that I'll touch on is transmission. We know from that 20% scenario when we're talking 10 gigawatts in Nebraska and 10 gigawatts in South Dakota, there's not that much load out here. We got to get that energy somewhere. So transmission is an integral part of that high penetration scenario. There is no transmission available to transport wind energy. No one lives where the wind blows, and that is true, okay, on the scale that we're talking about. We've done this 25 megawatts without building a whole bunch of transmission. We will probably be able to get 50 gigawatts, okay, without, doing some things around the margins. But to get to the 100 gigawatts and beyond that, we have to build big transmission. Otherwise, it won't happen. Extra high voltage transmission, 345 kV and above, is getting some new attention. Okay, I was around when we tried to build the Bandstand line. It got a lot of attention. It was the wrong kind back then. That was also the time in Minnesota that some farmers were sawing down lattice steel towers on the HVDC line. We need to get around those somehow if we're going to do this, because transmission is absolutely critical. The variability and uncertainty, if we have transmission, we're aggregating variability and uncertainty over a very large area, and it gets smoother and smoother and smoother and smoother. So you can see how transmission, that infrastructure, enables us to get around the problems we would otherwise have with that amount of wind generation. There's plans out there. We are currently working on a study. It's sort of a follow-on to the 20% report, where we're looking at 20% in the Eastern Interconnection. And I should say the Eastern Interconnection is really the Dakotas borders all the way south to Texas. Texas isn't included, and then it'd be the rest of the East Coast. So we're looking at 230 gigawatts there. We have a scenario where we're taking good wind, so all that's in Oklahoma, Panhandle of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota. We have to build a lot of transmission to get it east. It costs a lot of money, but you know what? In the east, their supply is expensive right now because they burn natural gas every single hour of the day. It's on the margin. It sets the price. If you can get wind energy into those markets, you can pay for that transmission, okay? And that doesn't even include the reliability benefits. We may not have to build nuclear or coal because transmission will allow the resources in that part of the country to help, in a reliability sense, the rest of the country and vice versa. Okay, so transmission could do a lot. It's a huge challenge, though, to get from where we're at now to something like this, because we've never done it before. However, we do have an infrastructure in place that I think is getting us along that road. We have the ISO, Independent System Operator, RTO is a regional transmission organization. Where you have wholesale energy markets, you have an ISO or RTO, and they run the show, basically. They administer the markets, and they have other functions that they fulfill. The Midwest ISO, in this part of the world, ISO New England, New York ISO, PJM Interconnection, ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, they're on their own, like I said before, and then Southwest Power Pool. And this graphic is out of date because Nebraska is now in the Southwest Power Pool. And with regard to wind, that is very, very significant. Because what that means, right off, forget building new transmission, is that wind that's built in Nebraska will not have to be managed just by the Nebraska utilities. Okay? That responsibility is going to be shared across the Southwest Power Pool. And so we get diversity and aggregation benefits, and we also have a larger number of resources in terms of individual generating units to control, to do that. So that is a critical first step. But to get to these obscene numbers of gigawatts in the ground, okay, we need to think larger than that. And so rather than in an individual ISO or RTO, we need to think across the whole footprint. And the notion of super regional or interconnection-wide transmission planning is gaining some traction in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. because there's benefits you can get looking down at that.